Guys, this week we're going to be covering some topics related to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, and how that relates to land protection. I wanted to focus in just on the topic of building resilience into conservation easements specifically. This is both resilience that helps the document of the easement be a enduring document, as well as just some considerations in how we craft our conservation easements to ensure that they're actually promoting climate adaptation and biodiversity. So the topic of resilience landscapes, resilience can be a little bit of an ambiguous term. We hear it thrown around a lot with conservation easements. Generally speaking, when we talk about climate resilience, we're thinking about how we can work at a landscape scale to have our habitats and ecosystems bounce back after disasters. How do we sort of build resilience at multiple scales to allow ecosystems to also shift and respond in that sort of one-way direction that we know is happening with climate change. When landscapes change, when they shift in response to climate shifts, that there can be issues for conservation easements. Sometimes landscape changes could actually conflict with a conservation easement's purpose, or those landscape changes could create conflicts with specific conservation easement restrictions in the future. And so it's important at this point for land trusts to be really forward thinking and considering what sort of easement purposes they're citing, and also just the specific terms of the easement to build in some durability there. You guys have at this point become pretty familiar with some of the documents that are required when we work on conservation easements. So of course there's the conservation easement itself, and within the easement we have purpose language, the recitals, and then the restrictions and the reserve rights. Accompanying the easement, of course, is the baseline documentation report that gives us a good sense of the condition of the property at the time the easement was completed. That BDR, as you all know, is an important reference document for the life of the conservation easement. One thing we haven't talked about as much is adaptive forest management plans. Many land trusts require a forest management plan be completed on forest properties, and that those forest management plans become part of just the agreement. The fact that we can move some of the more prescriptive terms of an agreement into a living document is really helpful for a land trust and a landowner. As you know, if we tried to capture all the details of what might be in a forest management plan in the easement itself, science is evolving and changing over time. Best management practices are evolving. New threats like invasive species, of course, are come about down the road, things that can't be anticipated. So it's really helpful to have a living document of a forest management plan to capture a lot of the agreement about how management can uphold the core purpose and values of an easement. So when you reflect on that purpose clause in a conservation easement, often it's referred to as sort of the heart of the easement, and it's going to be the standard against which the current and the future activities are always going to be evaluated. So that purpose clause establishes what the conservation values are and why they're so important. So when we think about building resilience into the conservation easements and into our conservation purpose, it sometimes conservation easements can contain a severability clause. It might state that when the purpose ceases to exist, that other purposes can persist and take precedence. And that's going to be a really important backup plan for easements. If we hang our hat on a purpose, conservation purpose, perhaps we're saying that the easement is in place really to protect one important habitat type, but over time it might be that with climate shifts, sea level rise, marsh migration, that habitat ceases to exist. In that case, it would be really important to have other purposes listed and acknowledged. There's an interesting paper written by an author, Jay Olmsted, that suggests language that climate change effects cannot serve as a basis for the modification or the termination of a conservation easement agreement, and that to actually reference the protection of emerging ecosystems, to place a priority on protecting some of the resilience characteristics and ecological systems. So really to hang our hat on protecting the stage rather than the actors in our conservation easements. And then also really to specifically state that the conservation easement will continue to serve its purpose despite land changes over time. The next section of an easement, the recitals, often tell the story of the project in detail. It provides sort of a perpetual record of the land and the date the easement was completed and a description of why the land trust believed that the project was important. Resilient recitals can really enumerate some of the property's values. It can talk about the importance of conserving aquatic and terrestrial biological resources, and also the importance of sustaining climate resilience over time. It can actually sort of hang its hat on some unique geology types. These are qualities, the soil types and the geology types are not going to change even as habitat shift and change. So being able to reference those are, of course, enduring qualities of a property. Can also talk about the land's role in providing microclimates and the importance of providing connectivity at the landscape scale. A little more on protecting resilience characteristics through reserved rights and restrictions in an easement. It can be really important to limit habitat loss and fragmentation. One of the tools that we know we can use in the land protection world is to use easements to promote connectivity. And even though when we look sort of at a broad scale and we see the map colored in green, showing that a conservation easement is in place, it really comes down to understanding the details of the easement itself and the language in the easement to know if it actually has reserve rights and restrictions that are going to allow for thoughtful connectivity in the landscape. So one of the ways that we can do that, of course, is to limit habitat loss and fragmentation. We know that fragmentation on the landscape is going to limit the movement of species and habitats over time. Also identifying and protecting unique geophysical settings and intact biological conditions. An easy go-to for this is actually to prioritize protecting riparian areas. We know that riparian areas in particular serve so many important climate purposes. They're important microclimates for organisms. They are where a lot of the biological diversity is, and at a larger scale, they're also really important for movement of terrestrial species and aquatic species. A few more thoughts on reserve rights and restrictions in a conservation easement. The reserve rights and restrictions give us the opportunity to establish some enforceable and clear standards for permanent protection of biodiversity. The conservation easement could ensure that terrestrial and aquatic wildlife movement are maintained or enhanced, that landforms that provide microclimates are prioritized and not damaged, and that sensitive or underprotected habitat types have sort of special consideration in the conservation easement. Another important strategy for addressing climate might be to think more broadly when a land trust is completing their baseline documentation report. That document includes a detailed description of the property with maps, but it would probably be helpful to the land trust to consider the soils and geophysical settings in their baseline documentation report, to spend a little bit of extra time mapping and understanding riparian corridors and floodplain areas, and to map those fragmenting features on the landscape as well, to make sure that all existing roads and fencing, ditching, and transmission lines are mapped and understood. It's important always to include a description of some of the problem areas on a property as well. We would want to describe areas where we see extensive invasive species, especially invasive species that are sort of have a competitive advantage because of climate conditions and changing climate conditions. Those are things that can later be addressed in the forest management plan if they have been documented on the front end. And folks can actually use the documentation, baseline documentation report to have a little bit of space and time to create this snapshot of the property, not just as a reference point for the easement, but as a tool to assist landowners in their own adaptation strategy over time. So as a tool to feed into the forest management plan, and again, that living document that allows the land trust to work with the landowner as they adapt to changing habitats due to a changing climate. So one more shout out for embracing management plans with working with landowners. We know that adaptive management plans are an active management regime that includes really an iterative process. It requires change over time. As land changes, our information about land management and ecology evolve. So this allows the plan to change without needing to amend the conservation easement. Some conservation easements refer to management plans that take effect only if certain landscape changes occur. So usually these adaptive management plans recognize that the world is a changing place and seek to acknowledge and incorporate those changes. This differs from active management that would serve to combat the changes and keep the land in its sort of initial condition. All right, that's a little overview on conservation easements and incorporating climate considerations.